Hello. How you guys doing? Yeah, all right, wow.
Hi, Dan.
How's it going, dude?
Pretty good.
Cool. Let's pretend like we weren't just talking backstage. For like 20 minutes. So I want to set the table for this conversation briefly, if I can, in terms of how I've become such a fan of Neil and put a perspective on what I think Naughty Dog has done. So basically, in the movie side of things, in like the 1940s, 50s, 60s, Hollywood made a lot of big, glossy, fun movies. And then it wasn't until the 70s that we had the Easy Rider, Raging Bull, Taxi Driver, those kinds of grounded, gritty, really about something stories. And then in the 80s, really, I feel like Spielberg took that, and what the beginning of Amblin movies are, took that 70s sensibilities and married it with big, fun stuff. And I kind of feel like in the games industry, it wasn't until maybe 10 years ago, and I'm going to speak kind of in generalities, that we were getting suddenly these great indie games, and I think of like Braid and Flower and Journey and those kinds of experiences that were like really elevated, emotional, artful experiences. And AAA was doing what it was doing. But Uncharted and that game series was sort of like Raiders of the Lost Ark, where it was incredible. Raiders of the Lost Ark was nominated for an Academy Award when it came out, but ultimately just a really great, well-executed, big, fun movie. But it was so well written, and the characters were so funny and interesting, and Uncharted was that, I think, in marrying that elevated sensibility with still AAA production and delivery. Last of Us, to me, really takes that to the next level in pairing incredibly grounded, gritty, emotional storytelling with big thrills, and to me that is like Close Encounters or E.T. or the real, like you're still delivering a commercial experience, but with indie sensibilities and with a real mind for storytelling in a way that we don't often get in games or hadn't been until these pivot points. Anyway, so that's my perception of you and why I feel like we are having this conversation. So I wanted to start off by asking you, when you fantasized about making games or movies as a kid, I don't know which one was, or telling stories as a grown-up, what were you thinking about? What did you want to do? Was there anything that particularly inspired you, or something that you have finally done or still have not yet to do?
Yeah, I don't know if it was growing up. I didn't think of game as a profession. Like I played a ton of games, and only like once I was in college did the thought enter, like, wait a minute, so many people make this. Maybe there's a path to making this thing that I'm really passionate about. But I was always really drawn to good storytelling, whether it was comic books, movies, games. I was especially drawn to narrative-based games, like all the old Sierra Online games, King's Quest, Space Quest, the LucasArts games, Monkey Island. So those were always there. And then
were you more drawn to them than any Mario or
Well, so I moved to the U.S. because I grew up in Israel and consoles weren't a thing back then. So I moved to the U.S. in '89, and that's when I first played Mario and fell in love with all this back catalog of Nintendo games. Yeah. So I was very much drawn to action games as well, like growing up playing Double Dragon, Streets of Rage, Outrun, all these arcade games, and then at some point, right, seeing this convergence of how you could combine action and storytelling and character-driven stuff. So I guess at some point when I was thinking of getting into games, I was very much with the mindset of like, well, how do we tell better stories? What are the games, like when playing Half-Life, when after graduating high school and just being blown away, where it was like you could tell a cinematic story with no cutscenes. Yeah. You could do a lot of storytelling in an action kind of environment. So that was always really intriguing. And then obviously I, very privileged, very luckily landed at Naughty Dog, which were trying to solve the same problems and were very much interested in character-driven story action games.
And can you, for frame of reference, your role evolved while you were at Naughty Dog. So on Uncharted 1, you were a...
So on Jack 3, I was a programming intern. Then I was a designer on Jack PSP, which was mostly canceled at Naughty Dog. Then I became a designer / co-writer on Uncharted 1, lead designer on Uncharted 2, creative director on Last of Us.
Got it. And what were some of the first things from a storytelling perspective, let's say on Uncharted 1, that you were excited to implement, that you felt like had not happened yet?
Well, the thing that was interesting for me personally, having this kind of weird perspective, is I was on this Jack PSP title while Uncharted 1 was taken off, led by Amy Hennig. And so I could kind of watch it from the side and see this, we were a studio that was making these kind of cartoony action character mascots. And now we're doing this very grounded, at the time, here's a character that doesn't have a crazy outfit. Here's allies that are with him that are trying to tell a very grounded personal story in this pulp action adventure genre. So I'm like there kind of like learning how to do level layouts and doing some script writing on this Jack and Daxter title while this thing is coming along, and I'm checking the network and I'm watching the trailers. I'm just like so stoked for this. Here's the hero, he's wearing Chucks. And then at some point to like be able to get on it and help shape that, I felt like I was in the luckiest position. Like I couldn't dream at the time of like doing something like that, working with such talented people around me, trying to create this franchise.
Right. But just to hone in on this, was there anything that you drew in? Was there anything that you felt like games hadn't done, narratively speaking, that entered into your writing process? Or was it just you just saw that character and you were just writing for that character?
I don't know about games, because there's definitely have been games that have told great stories before, but at least at Naughty Dog, as far as process, we were really trying to come at things less from set piece design approach, which we did like a lot on Jack and Daxter. It was like, Daxter's going to ride a missile. Cool. We'll figure out later how that fits into the story.
Right.
And this was more, how do we think about character motivation? And when there's an action, when there's a gameplay scenario, it has to be motivated by what the characters are doing and ultimately what this thing is about. And we've gotten better at that with each game we've made since.
Wow. But it's important to underline that though that was not your starting point, those games still have incredible set pieces and incredible moments of excitement that to get those, you don't need to start with them and say, how do we make the cool thing, how do we create an excuse for the cool thing to happen?
Right.
You can still start from character, and in fact, the fun is enjoying these characters in those heightened moments. Just to leap ahead to Last of Us, is there... what was the genesis of that in terms of at what point did you start with the story, the concept, the conceit of that? Did you start with, wouldn't it be cool to have a mechanic where the bad guys are making sounds and you have to avoid how did that come to be?
That's a hard one, because none of these games start with any one idea. It's like a collection of ideas from different people. For me, my journey with The Last of Us started as a failed student project where I was at Carnegie Mellon and we had to pitch a game idea to George Romero for a Night of the Living Dead game.
Wow.
And pitched, kind of like took an idea of like, okay, what if you took Eco and combined it with like characters from Sin City, and kind of cobbled together this pitch of like this guy that has to protect this girl, and they had this whole hand-holding mechanic exactly like Eco.
Right.
And at some point he had this heart condition, and then you took control of the girl and you had to protect the guy. And George Romero picked a totally different pitch than that one. But I liked that idea so much, I kept like toiling away at it. I was like, maybe it could be a comic book. And then I pitched it to Image Comics, and they told me, like it, but don't love it, we're going to pass. So like that project failed again, so I shelved it. And then we were working, after Uncharted 2, Naughty Dog co-presidents at the time, Evan Wells and Christoph Balestra, decided to split the studio into 2 teams. So one team was making Uncharted 3, the other was going to do a reboot of Jak and Daxter. And Bruce Straley, my directing partner, we were working very hard on trying to make something with Jak that we got passionate about, but the people that really loved Jak and owned it were no longer at Naughty Dog, and we couldn't find an angle into that franchise. So at some point we asked our bosses, like, can we do anything? Can we be something else? And that's when they like, yeah, sure. We just thought Jak would be easier because you're starting with something, but if you have another idea. And that's when I had this, okay, I have this comic book idea. Bruce and I worked very closely on Uncharted 1 and Uncharted 2. So we have had all these discussions about character interactions, how do you build relationship through gameplay, and we got to try out some stuff like that on Uncharted 2, some of these theories. And Bruce brought his sensibilities, and then so that was my path, but I'm sure Bruce can explain his own path, and everybody had their own paths of how to get into this, and then this thing grew and evolved and eventually became The Last of Us.
That is crazy. It's crazy, too, that the initial idea about switching, and now the girl is helping the guy, manifested its way in one of a real stunning moment in Last of Us from a structural standpoint that games rarely do. That was a part of the initial concept is rad. I'm really itching to get to this place where we talk about how mechanics work in the narrative, because that to me is this thing that theoretically is the difference between what I do in making movies and TV versus, because I don't have to be a slave to mechanics. I can just tell the story the way it's told. However,
I envy you.
Right, but what I do and what anyone else who's making movies and TV, we are a slave to the genre, right? So on the one hand, if I'm trying to tell a story about how people deal with Cloverfield Lane, how people deal with fear, I story about a girl who's always running away from her problems and has to, finally face them. And that's really what's fascinating to me. Is I love characters that break cycles, so that me and the actors were all talking about what that is in real life and how that can be in this movie and all that. But at the same time, got to deliver the fun, got to deliver the thrills. So you are a slave to genre conventions too, and this scene has to create suspense. It can't just be about these people talking. It can't just be about this theme. We don't want that. I don't enjoy that in movies anyway. Right. So I do have to figure that out. And I'm wondering what that's like, what you're faced with when you have to deal with we have to have this great shootout in this set piece. We want to have a great moment for hand-to-hand, whatever, but really I want to tell the story about how this person is interacting with this other girl, Joel and Ellie's story. And so has there ever been a real bind that you found yourself in where, oh boy, like, I know we got to do this, but I really want to be doing that, you know what I mean?
Yeah, so first of all, when we talk genre, we're always saying, okay, what's our gameplay genre and what's our narrative genre? Because those are not always the same, right? Mm-hmm. Like gameplay genre, you think about The Last of Us is a action survival shooter. The story genre, it's, I don't even know how you describe it, like we talked about, like there's, even that can break into, like there's the Guardian genre, where you look at like Aliens and Road to Perdition. There's a kind of horror genre, if you're looking at and there's even within that more specific, like the zombie genre.
Right.
So first is like you try to familiarize with everything that exists in that genre, so you understand or as close as you can understand, what is a classical structure of those different aspects. From gameplay, what expectations are players walking in for gameplay? And then how do we evolve that? How do we subvert it sometimes in interesting ways? So when we talk about, I guess, where mechanic, I'm trying to think where we hit a bind, but what's coming to mind actually is Uncharted 2, of where we kind of, I felt, leveraged something really elegantly, was Jeff the cameraman when he gets injured. So we have like Nate and Elena, and we've been talking a lot about these characters throughout production. Nate is outwardly selfish, but inwardly he's got this altruistic, he wants to do the right thing, and that's represented externally by these two women in his life, Elena and Chloe. So this, and they have this guy that's been shot that's injured. And this argument is presented to Nate and therefore the player of like, we should leave this guy behind, this is what Chloe is saying, because that's how we save ourselves. And that's the aspect of Drake versus Elena saying, no, we risk ourselves to save someone we care about. And then you've been playing the entire game as Nate, and you have like this this crazy moveset, the way he climbs. It's all about these elegant jumps to what we call traversal gunplay. He's very nimble, and all of a sudden we take all of your moveset away, and you're moving slowly and clumsily as you're carrying this guy. So you're feeling out the argument, this narrative argument, through gameplay. And that took a while to get there, and you know, it took a lot of convincing as well to say it's okay to make something frustrating when it's helping the overall experience. So if you're looking at this in isolation, it's be like, oh man, this is a pretty frustrating bit of gameplay, but it helps everything around it. It helps what you're trying to do with the characters. It helps what you're trying to do with the arcs of the characters.
That is, I love that moment, and those to me are those peak moments that we've gotten to now in games where, and it's what I really draw on for making movies are these tying the player experience directly to the emotional experience of the protagonist, the thing that I think we've talked about Brothers: A Tale of Two Sons. That for me is a game that like it's about brothers who can't relate, and you're playing the game. One thumbstick is one brother, the other's. I mean, you're literally having a problem playing it. And I mean, the first time I played that game, and I have an older brother who we sometimes are at each other's throats, you know, and it's like I'm having an experience that gave me an aha moment about how I interact with my loved one from the way that I'm playing the game.
Right. And then getting so much power out of removing something.
Yes.
Which would, even to your film, right, there's a moment where someone gets shot and you removed audio, and that subtraction can be so shocking.
Right.
And it's such a great tool, and we look at mechanics the same way.
Right. But the interesting thing about games, and this is a large part of my assumption, but I feel like you build a certain set of systems that is utilized throughout the whole game. You have a great driving system, you have a great gunplay system, you have a great melee system. Anything else, I imagine, would be tricky because you've honed in on making those things refined and what the identity of the game is. But then you have these very specific moments that require a different bit of engine to pull off, I would imagine. Is that not the case, or does that not create some
so you have your core mechanics, which you could easily stamp out throughout the game, and it's about tuning knobs to create different scenarios. And then you have these very specific moments that require a ton of effort because they're one-offs sometimes, they're very unique. Like what comes to mind is when Joel falls on the rebar and he's injured, and Ellie's in front of you and she's trying to lead you along. That was a completely unique set of animations and tech to go to what is essentially a 5-minute sequence.
Right.
But you say this is so important in the story for what we're trying to say about these characters. Like the whole concept of The Last of Us is trying to build a bond and trying to replicate through mechanics and storytelling a bond of a father and a daughter. And it felt like that's so important to pull off, to feel Ellie's panic, to feel her starting to take charge, and it's that handoff of the baton, because the next sequence, you're playing as Ellie. And it felt like if we kind of dropped the ball in the sequence, if it wasn't as effective, then that moment when you're playing as Ellie wouldn't have been as magical as it turned out for a lot of players.
Was there ever anything that you wanted to do that you could like that, where you guys said, "Oh, we're gonna do it"? Was there ever anything that the technological, it was just too challenging in an earlier game, let's say, you know, that narrative moment may have sacrificed because you couldn't do this special thing that you would have liked to have done?
It wasn't for technological reason, and it wasn't later, it was after. For Uncharted 4, we have this flashback sequence with the two kids, and they're going through this manor, and it's about the thrill of them breaking in, and we're seeing how excited they are by these historical artifacts, these two brothers. And there is a moment where you could find two swords, and you have this whole sword fighting mechanic, and they're playing around, and it would like tutorialize this whole sword fight, so that when you have that final fight at the end of the game against Strafe and you're doing the sword fight, it's all mechanics you would have learned in this instance.
That's beautiful. Yeah.
But we were just out of time, and we had to like cut all of it to finish the game.
That's so. I keep on forgetting to tell you how amazing that. And I knew that this was the setup for later, but I love that you take the picture. You're holding the thing, and then you take the picture, and how amazing that. Seems like this frivolous little fun moment that I'm playing, but then you actually have a sense of primal nostalgia when you see that picture later in the game. Like, oh, I took, and that picture would look different. I imagine.
Wore a different hat.
If I had done a different, like how crazy. That's it's a wonderful marriage of gameplay, unique game, because I did that. I had that choice, married with really designed storytelling. You mentioned the word tutorial. God, and that's so genius that would have set up that later, and also would have pulled at the nostalgia strings. But
the director's cut.
Yeah, right. I want to talk about opening games, game openings, and tutorial sections, because when we grew up, games came with instruction manuals, and if you did not have an instruction manual, if you rented the game and they forgot it, whatever. You were stripped. Some games you just could not play that game. I remember calling up a friend, like me and my friend renting a game, and we didn't have the instruction manual, so we would like, oh, I think Jeff has that game. We'd call him up and say, how do you frickin' play this game? We've moved far beyond that now, which is wonderful. But now I feel like the opening must always be a real wrestle with narrative-focused games, with immersion-focused games, with how do we teach the player how to play, and without being like giant text prompts on screen. And the opening for Last of Us is one of the greatest game openings of all time. And I'm just curious how you finagle it. And by the way, movies have the same thing. I mean, when you see the opening to, so there's two Batman movies, right? The opening to Tim Burton's Batman, you're flying around that logo and you're hearing this bombastic Danny Elfman music. And the opening to Batman Begins, I don't remember, but essentially part of the opening is like grand Tibet or something, and you're at monastery and ninja. It's very grounded automatically. There is not that giant thematic score. You know, the movie is teaching you how to watch it. The Tim Burton Batman, the movie is saying, this is comic book, this is comic booky, enjoy, have fun. And the other is saying, this is gonna have some grit to it. I mean, the beginning of a Lethal Weapon movie is jokey, fun, the jokes between Murtaugh and, and the beginning of a cop movie like Narc is like handheld, documentary style, aggressive, like you've never seen a cop movie move like that. So the way something opens very much informs how to experience it, how to watch it. But games have mechanics. Games have some technical. So how do you wrestle with that? How do you deal with that?
Yeah, so as a team, we try to hold off on starting production on the intro as long as possible.
Interesting.
Because especially for a new IP, we don't know what the game is. We have some theories and ideas, but until you get it on the stick, you have no idea what's going to work and what's not going to work. So you start doing prototypes, and prototypes turn into systems, and then systems can get refined with animation, and somewhere down the road, you could do a proper focus test and say, okay, we finally know what our game is. Here are our core mechanics, minus the set pieces, minus the exceptions. Now we can finally start working on the intro, because only now we know what we're training. And by the way, this goes the opposite way as well. We can't work on the ending until we know what our core systems are, because we don't know what we're trying to, again, either subvert or find some climax of, or try what is the harder version of this. So what are we ramping up towards? We don't know until we know what the game is. So in production, the first thing in production is some level in the middle of the game. And then we're going to start working outwards from there. And then as far as training, yeah, so like you've mentioned, we have the hard job of the opening of the game. It's like, okay, we're trying to set up the characters, the world, the mechanics. We're trying to do it in a way that grabs you right away, so you're not like putting the game down and go back to whatever it is you were playing before. All in as succinct way as possible without throwing a giant box of text on the screen, which sometimes we have to revert to because we couldn't figure out a more elegant way of doing it.
Was there a case where at one point you could not crack the code of how to elegantly take this on, and then you finally did crack that code of like, oh, I know how we could display, articulate this?
I don't remember what was the process of it, but I was having lunch with Kurt Margenau, and we were talking about how we trained aim and shoot in The Last of Us.
Okay.
And it's this really, and I don't remember where the idea came from, but it's you're in this spore-infested tunnel, and the narrative is if you're breathing the spores, you're going to turn into a zombie-like creature. And this guy had some debris fall on him, his gas mask cracked, so he knows he's going to turn, and he begs you to kill him. And a prompt comes up like press L1 to aim, R1 to shoot. And it's this mercy kill, and it just works within the narrative, and it tells you so much about your character, the relationship, the world that exists, and it's low stakes because you're not in danger, and you could aim, and you could choose to pull the trigger or not, and then like your partner has to do it. But you've learned that mechanic through a narrative moment.
Right.
And that to me is one of the better examples that we've done. There's other examples where we're trying to teach you how a certain class of infected works, and we were not as successful as doing it in that. And that's where like a big block of text can come on and gives you some information about, okay, here's how you should stealth around this kind of enemy.
Well, that moment with the mercy kill, before that aha moment, what was that going to?
I don't remember.
Did you? Yeah,
I don't remember. It's so many years ago.
Yeah, totally. Interesting. Were there any other mechanic-based challenges where something was too overwhelming, as you were testing things, where people were just not getting it and you had to sacrifice some narrative things you were enjoying for, okay, we got to just illustrate this for people?
Uncharted 4, we kind of had to split the different, I think we lost some training elegance for pacing. So we had this boat chase sequence that chronologically takes place much later in the story, and originally was slotted to be later in the story. But as we're putting more and more of the game together, we saw, we have this pretty long opening without a lot of action. It's about, we're telling the story of these two brothers and how they grew up and they get to prison. Only at the end of this prison sequence do we finally have action. And we're not setting up the promise of the adventure, and that's where we felt like, okay, we could take this really kind of heavy action, big set piece, put it here in the beginning, and that kind of sets the promise of, okay, we're going to work our way back to this. But that meant we had to make it simpler, and then throw a lot of tutorials at you. Okay, here's how you swim, here's how you aim and shoot, here's how you take cover, all in a really short span of time. And then because so much time passes before you do those things again, we had to retrain those things later on a bit more elegantly than we did it here.
Interesting.
But I really liked in Uncharted 4 how we taught stealth during this. You're trying to sneak out of this boarding school, and there's this nun that's patrolling this area, and we touch you like all the stealth mechanics you're going to use later in this combat shootouts you're doing while you're trying to sneak out of your dorm room.
And and it's beautiful. You learn it as a kid, and then you as a player are learning it as you're the kid, and then you are employing it as an adult when you understand it better, which is kind of profound. Uncharted 4 also has this insane truck chase. It was the thing that you guys had, and probably the first demo at E3, I think.
Yes.
Right? Or the ish.
Well, the only
one of the
demo.
first things. The only right. It was that awesome standalone, holy shit awesomeness. That feels when you're playing it like you could drive anywhere. That it's suddenly completely open. Yet there's a lot of story beats that have to happen in that thing. So how did you handle that? And that reminds me of Half-Life 2 was Half-Life 2 was also an aha moment for me. And the opening to Half-Life 2, amazing and beautiful. And there's a chase breaks out, and you go on the rooftops, and run around. In those moments, I feel like I am just trying to get the hell away. I'm not thinking about where I'm allowed to go, where I'm not allowed to go. And yet, I somehow always end up going exactly where the game wants me to go. So with that in mind, how did you craft something that to feel open, and yet surely there is a track that I needed to be on at some point?
It's good design. Again, Kurt Margenau designed the layout for that, but so many people worked on that sequence. It was tested over and over to make sure, because there were paths that you went off, or you got completely turned around and started driving backwards, and we're like, okay, how long should we let you drive backwards before we throw some fail state? and say, you've lost Sam, because you're trying to get to your brother, you're trying to chase him throughout that whole sequence. But what I found worked well for that sequence again, that sequence works so well mechanically because you have all these you're using core systems while you're in the middle of a set piece, while there's like this narrative urgency, you're trying to save someone you really care about. That is like kind of like the classic formula of what makes an Uncharted set piece work. And that's when I guess we're at the top of our game for that franchise, and we wanted to throw everything at that piece. One, because we knew we would show it publicly, but two is from a narrative perspective, from where Nate's at, we wanted to have this thrilling moment. This is where he's at the height of his adventure. Even though it's for us, this would be like super dangerous, would be like crapping our pants from fear, but for him, this is what he does every day. This is what he gets off on. And then to be confronted with the lie of the relationship issues he's having in order to go on this adventure felt like a really strong contrast. So I wanted to get this adrenaline high and then this narrative low before that takes you on to like the last act of the adventure.
Are there like craft-wise go-tos of steering, lighting-wise, sound-wise, of how to nudge a player to go pick this route? It's better, you want to head over in this direction.
So it's graphic design, it's how you design the level, it's lighting, it's VO from your allies that are around you. There's a way to set up enemies in such a way that they're going to lure you towards them, and there's a way to set them up, like with the truck, where it's going to block your path, and it's blocking in such a way so it creates an angle from you to take a right turn. So there's a ton of tricks, some of which I'm not even aware of because, again, so many people worked on that sequence.
That's awesome.
Pretty amazing that it came together.
Yeah, let's talk about, you wanted to end Nate's story of that. I don't want to put any words in your mouth, so I'm being careful with what I say. And I'm just curious how you thought about how do you craft an ending for this character, but you didn't have any interest in killing off that character. How did you come to making that feel finite
so first we kind of looked backwards. So as a team, we came to the conclusion that we wanted this to be the end of Nathan Drake's arc, like this 4-game story. So first it was looking backwards to say, okay, what has been happening until now? Because that all has to be a setup for this. And the thing we kind of figured out is like, okay, there's this pattern here where he gets lost in this adventure, he gets wrapped up with quote-unquote bad guys, these illegal activities, but he keeps coming back to this family, and that's mostly represented by Sylvan and Elena. And then the start of the next game, we see something happened where that relationship has fallen apart, and he's gone back to these old habits, this obsession. We use a lot of drug metaphors when we're talking about Uncharted 4, that he's like a sort of an addict to these things. So to say, okay, what would have to happen for him to finish that, to not revert back to this self? And that's what we said, okay, so one, we wanted to show that conflict that always happens between games in the game. And that meant, okay, well, then we have to show his life between the games. That's why we had this home sequence and try to make that playable. That was its own challenge. And then going forward to say, okay, what would have to happen? What kind of decision and choice he would have to make to say, okay, this time it sticks. And we said he would have to, and then we talked a lot about relationship. It was almost like that game was like therapy in a way. To say, okay, you're trying to balance home life between your life's passion, which I'm sure you're familiar with, and because, and then it's about a compromise. It's about finding this middle ground where you could allow yourself to do both. Because if you give up one for the other, you're doomed. You're bound for failure. And that's what we wanted to say at the end, that he was able to find this compromise, to find this way to live this life minus the illegal, the dangerous aspects of it. So initially we didn't have the epilogue where you play his daughter and you see that this time it's stuck. Again, I'm bringing him up a lot today, but I had lunch with Kurt Marganow. So it used to end with like this final conversation with Nate and Elena at the dock, and we're talking about how like that didn't feel final enough. Like how do you know, like, a year later, he doesn't go back to the same thing? And that's where I felt like, okay, we have to show that this time. It's like we have to jump to the future.
Yeah.
And that felt like an interesting way to do it, to show you like his legacy through someone else's eyes.
Yeah.
And that's how we got
beautiful.
up there.
Yeah, so rad. At what point did this is an interesting device in using Crash Bandicoot as a bookend as well? How did that enter for you guys narratively?
Yeah, so production on Uncharted 4 was a little funny because Bruce and I as directors came on partway through production. So there were certain assets that were already there, and we're trying to figure out how to use them, what should go where. And there was a dance sequence in the old version of the story that we were trying to, okay, maybe there's a way to use it in this home sequence that we now have. It's like, oh, what if like Nate and Elena are she's trying to convince him to take dance lessons, and he refuses, and as a gesture towards her, we'll do this dance sequence in their home, and we could not make that work, and we couldn't figure out an interesting fail. What happens if I'm not pressing the button? He steps on her toes, and they laugh. And that's where we just started brainstorming and said, what if, like, I don't know, they play the video game against each other? Like, okay, what could be an interesting game? It's like, when we started looking at like our old catalog, and it's like, well, Way of the Warrior, no, probably not. It's like, oh, what if it was Crash Bandicoot? It started as a joke, like, we need to get Crash Bandicoot, and then company meetings would tell Evan Wells, our boss, you need to get the rights to Crash Bandicoot, because Activision owns Crash Bandicoot. He's like, yeah, sure, I'm on it. But then he shot out an email, and a conversation started, and pretty soon he came back, he's like, looks like it might happen. We should start building this thing. So even without having the final approval, we started building out the Boulder level that we felt like is the most famous level in our minds of.
And it's reflective of
Indiana
Uncharted
Jones.
1, like it.
And in Indiana Jones.
Right.
And like every game since then, we've done what we call like the crash cam sequence.
Right.
Where it's some sequence where you're running towards a camera with something chasing you or something falling apart.
Right.
And then we like pretty late got the rights to do it, and then threw it in there, and it would turn out to be this great Easter egg.
That's so rad. That's so awesome. Is there anything from movies, TV, what have you, that
And also, sorry, real quick, because the other thing that felt really special about that one, for myself, and I know for other people at the company that didn't work on Crash, it felt like almost like a love letter to everything Naughty Dog has worked towards since those days. Like we're making these platformers, again, Crash was inspired by Indiana Jones in a similar way to how Uncharted was, and now it felt like sort of an end of an era, and to put that in there felt really special in that way.
That's rad. You can feel, that is what it felt like, so it's nice to hear that that's what it is. So movies, TV, anything that you're watching now or that you are watching while you're making these games that you've drawn specific inspiration from outside of like zombies, but pivotal narrative moments that you're like, oh, wonder if I could do that in a game that works so well cinematically, but I don't know that I could pull that off given what you might feel your limitations are in being a game.
Nothing like that comes to mind. There used to be stuff like that. I remember when I first saw Children of Men, and it was so well done and so well executed. I remember walking out of the theater like angry that why aren't games telling these kinds of stories more? It doesn't always have to be about like a big alien invasion. Like here's like a really intimate story told in genre extremely well, and you could tell we drew a lot of inspiration from The Last of Us, from Children of Men.
Right.
I guess more recently, again, it doesn't have that same kind of inspiration, but there's a show on Netflix called End of the Fucking World.
Oh yeah, I just watched it.
Which is so well written and acted and quirky, has been totally inspiring for some of the stuff we're doing in T2. Again, more on a dialogue stuff.
You're making a Terminator 2 game?
That's
amazing.
Yes.
But wait, I would argue Terminator 2 might have inspired some Joel-Ellie relationship things, perhaps unintentional. Or
No, that was totally when we were trying to break down what we call the Guardian genre.
Right.
We're totally looking at Sarah Connor and John Connor and that relationship.
That's awesome. Well, I'm trying to think of how we may extrapolate what Last of Us 2 is going to be like if it's at all inspired by End of the Fucking World. Is there anything I know you can't really talk about Last of Us 2 things, but is there anything that you're trying to accomplish with that? Conceptually, narrative, like, I hope that it does this, or even if it's not that, maybe it's a game that you might make after Last of Us 2, but like, I wanna. Oh, you know what? Actually, let me put this frame of reference on it, because you've been working in this action adventure genre, third-person action adventure genre, pretty much this whole time. Is that just because that's been what's in front of you, or do you specifically get excited about this genre over working on a first-person shooter or in an open-world RPG, or what? Like, why this genre? Why have you? I imagine you could have left it at any point to go dabble in something else, or not dabble, but what has kept you here, or do you want to leave it?
I mean, some of my favorite games are third person. Even when I go back to those Sierra adventure games,
right.
I love that they were third person. I love somehow I can identify more with that character when they're on screen than in first person.
Totally.
It can be done in first person. It has been done extremely well with certain games. And in fact, when we were working on The Last of Us and we were given the go-ahead to do something other than a reboot of Jak and Daxter, we were brainstorming whether it should be first person or third person, what genre. Like, we kind of went broad with what the game could be, whether it should be multiplayer only or single player. And then once everything started falling together, we've ended up, okay, it's third person, but it's more intimate, so the camera's going to be closer, so it's a bit more of a first person feel, but you're still seeing your character on the screen. But we would totally, we've done racing games, we've done other genres in the past. We joked about if we were ever to do Half-Life 3, how would we do it? And what would it be like a Naughty Dog first-person game?
What would that be like?
It'd be amazing. I don't know, we'll see. So we're totally open, the future of the next game that we do might not be third person.
Interesting. It's so true. I was often asked this when I was doing junket for Cloverfield Lane, because people were comparing it to the original Cloverfield movie, and how I find third-person games far more immersive than first-person games. Theoretically, a first-person game, there should be nothing more immersive than that. It is you are the protagonists. You are it. You're doing it. Look at how you are so inside this character. And yet, I think you really need to observe behavior to feel empathy. So me seeing the way that Nate traverses, the way that Ellie deals with stuff, the way that Joel, when I'm observing that behavior, I then care for that guy, and I want to see him succeed, or right. And it encourages the try in me, that just saying I'm the guy, I'm the silent protagonist, and it's all happening to me, I don't feel connected to that. I feel like I'm on a roller coaster ride, for the most part. There are exceptions.
It's trade-offs, and it changes how you approach mechanics or how you approach storytelling. If you're writing dialogue for first person, it's got to be more explicit because you're not seeing your character. So you either have to do some hand acting, or be more explicit, or have other NPCs take on the load of some of the narrative weight.
Interesting. As we near the end of this conversation, so people don't get mad at me for not asking, there have been announcements of some movies based on your games. Are there any? So there's an Uncharted movie that's being made. Sean Levy is directing. We know that. Tom Holland is starring in that. And there was also a Last of Us movie at some point. Is there anything you can say about either of those things?
Not much. The Uncharted movie, we've had some conversation with Sean Levy, and he's really passionate, gets it, and I think he understands where we're at. We've kind of evolved our feelings towards these kind of adaptations over the years, where we used to just be excited, oh my God, movies are looking at us. Look, there could be an Uncharted movie on the screen, and then as more time passes on, we're not excited by a direct adaptation of the story we told, because we feel like we've already told that story very well cinematically, so I don't know what else you could bring to it.
Yes.
And even I worked on the script for the Last of Us film, which was a direct adaptation, and now having some separation from it, I look back and be like, I don't want that movie to be made.
I agreed with that.
Maybe there's something that could be done in the world, either focusing on other characters or other time. But for me, and I know for Naughty Dog and for a lot of our fans, like Nolan North is Nathan Drake, like Ashley Johnson is Ellie, Troy Baker is Joel, and it would be very disorienting to see someone else in that role. And the kind of example I try to give people is like, okay, you just saw Breaking Bad. Breaking Bad is this amazing show. Now someone says like, okay, let's make the movie of Breaking Bad. We're going to cast someone else as Walter White. It's like, it doesn't make sense. It just feels wrong on so many levels.
Although I would argue Fargo, the TV series, did take that on, but also to your point,
but didn't have any of the original characters from the movie.
right? It was akin to that. It really was.
Yeah, so it captured the tone, it
right.
captured the world, it expanded that. I love that show, and
Me
I
too.
think that's the way to do it.
Yes.
So going back to your question and the conversation we had with Sean, who's now attached to Uncharted, is like him wanting to tell a different story than the main 4 adventures with potentially a young Nathan Drake that fills in the gaps, I think is a lot more interesting than trying to retell Uncharted 1, 2, 3, or 4.
Totally agree. That's awesome, man.
Yeah.
Exciting. All right, thanks, guys. It's the end of our time.
Cool.
Appreciate it.
Cool.